All right, everyone. Hello, good evening. Happy Tuesday to all of you. That's right. Today is Tuesday. It's not Monday. It's not Wednesday. It's Tuesday. And on Tuesdays, we do a very important thing. What do? That's right. We read. And of course, we're going to continue to read Far Country by Peter L. Rice. First 24 chapters are up on my YouTube channel, so feel free to stop out there, get caught up, listen to what you haven't listened to, and it doesn't need to be now. It could be later. It could be that you decide that you're going to do so after this, and you'll get caught up and you'll listen on your next drive or whatever the case may be. Either which way, it's Far Country. The only place where we have sentient aliens in the Battletech universe. Isn't it nice? Isn't it keen? Don't you wish that they were green? I don't know why. So, everybody go ahead, sit back, relax, and prepare to enjoy, because we'll get ourselves involved in our story time here in just one moment. I just want to check one thing, make sure I know what it's doing. Recording output. I want you to go not to there. I want you to go to Far Country. Select this folder. File format. I guess the MKV will work. We might have to remux it later, but that's okay. There we go. Got the recording going where I need the recording to go. And now we're going to have our story time. Enjoy, everybody. Thanks so much for being here with me. "25. Takuda was right. Everything about this situation was new and different. The humans were the ones who were the aliens. They had always believed one should change the environment to fit one's needs, seizing anything they wanted or needed and molding it to their requirements. Now, it was the reverse. The Tatate were the ones who fit the environment. The humans were the outsiders. Not only were they outsiders, they were also unable to change the surroundings to suit their desires. The humans did not have enough of anything to fill their needs. They could survive on their own for a while, but sooner or later they would exhaust their meager supplies. They would have to adapt or perish. Takuda was one of the first to accept the reversal. He, who had been a member of a rigid hierarchy for his entire life, seemed to find it easiest to change. Perhaps it was the responsibility for the lives of the others that made him open to the necessity. Perhaps it was in his nature. In either case, he listened to the words of Dakota and the others and did what was necessary. By the third day in the caves, the humans were well enough to travel. Takuda decided that it was time to act, even if there was no real plan. The mercenaries had been given 3 days of grace to deal with the enclaves, and it would take more days for his team to reach the river. They would have to move, and move with purpose. The Tatate had been helpful during the recovery, feeding the humans and generally fussing over them at all times. There was something unnerving about having one of the little creatures squatting at your feet when you fell asleep, and even more unnerving to awaken with him still there. They seemed to have the ability to sleep with one eye socket closed and the other open and alert. Very weird. The humans got used to it, each one according to his nature. Andy Holland was the first. Dana Lost only grudgingly. Before they could move, Takuda had to reorganize his team. The casualties suffered by the DEST members made it even more imperative that Jacobs improve his mech piloting skills. Goodall worked with him throughout the hours of daylight and on into the hours of darkness to get him up to speed. She was sure that with enough training he would become a good pilot, but time was one thing they sorely lacked. Under normal circumstances, it would take weeks simply to master the maneuvering of the complicated machine. That was one of the functions of the neurohelmet. With the helmet linked to his brain, a mech warrior could maintain fine balance without conscious thought. But no matter what Goodall and Jacobs did, they just couldn't get the helmet to work well for Jacobs. Perhaps it had been damaged in some indecipherable way, and that was what made it do strange things at the most unexpected times. Goodall simply didn't have weeks to train Jacobs. The weapon systems were another problem. After mastering the machine, a pilot would normally be expected to spend additional time on the range. It was not so much that he had to learn to shoot, but that a mech warrior had to become aware of the heat surges that the weapons transmitted to the mech. Heat was the real killer of mechs on the battlefield, and more than one pilot had ignored the climbing heat indicator at his own peril. In that way, the Locust was in its element. The light mech had enough heat sinks that it could bleed off all the heat it generated, either by maneuver or fire or both combined. Goodall saw no reason why Jacobs had to be warned about heat. They'd save that subject for later discussion. When the two pilots weren't maneuvering the mech through the woods, they were talking about how a mech worked. Goodall talked tactics and deployment of the mech lance until she had Jacobs convinced that the mech was the ruler of the battlefield. Then she had to turn around and teach him that the king of the battlefield was vulnerable as well. There were many things, she explained, that mechs did poorly or could not do at all. She was adamant about fighting in towns. Those were places that a mech should avoid. Heavy vegetation and steep defiles were another hazard. Mechs liked open, rolling terrain, she told him. No steep defiles, no heavy woods, no buildings, and no infantry. Infantry could be deadly if not treated with respect, and mech-proofed infantry like the DEST team should be avoided at all costs. The two mech pilots were supported by Sagiri Johnson and Underos Yapudi, the remaining techs. Technical support for the Mercenary Lance had been thin to begin with, and with only one tech for each mech, the Takuda pilots had to do much of the work themselves. Jacobs was perfectly happy tinkering away on his machine with the help and direction of the two technicians, and Goodall was humble enough to wade into the grease and oil as required. Vost would never have gotten his hands dirty on a mech, even his own, but the two pilots and two techs with Takuda were perfectly happy working together in the innards of one of the Locusts. They were even able to repair and replace the shattered windscreen on Jacobs's mech. The Tatate had shown the humans how to heat and bend a lovely, clear crystal sheet found in veins in the caves. It wasn't as strong as the original material, and it would shatter in the most inconvenient way if struck by a heavy object, but Jacobs could at least see through it. Organizing his team had turned out to be an even more difficult task for Takuda. He made Parker DeVood his aide in the headquarters section, which meant he could move George Busteau into Arsenal section. The heavy weapons section would have to operate a man short, for there was no way to replace Inaduma. Sine would have to double as both section leader and anti-armor specialist. She was perfectly capable of handling the job, capable of any job requirements in any position within DEST, but the move would put a strain on the section's capabilities. And so, after 3 days of rest and recuperation, Takuda took his troops toward the setting sun, the enclaves, and a tentative future. The foot troops moved first, the mechs bringing up the rear. This allowed for security ahead, while Jacobs and Goodall continued to maneuver and train together. Jacobs learned as he went, and improved. The first day he toppled the Locust twice. The second day, only once. On the third day, he was able to maneuver without mishap even when putting the mech into a run. That evening, as they bedded down the equipment, Jacobs emerged from the cockpit with a beatific smile across his face. He was doing what he'd always dreamed of. The trek was difficult because of the terrain and the material carried, but it would have been impossible without the Tatate bearers. As in the retreat from the dropship, the Tatate carried much of the excess equipment. They were superb at the job, carrying heavier loads than the humans expected, and at greater speeds than even the unencumbered humans could manage. The only problem with the Tatate was their inveterate curiosity. At the end of the first day, Takuda was appalled at the condition of the cargo. Every weapon, sensor device, and heavy missile had been disassembled. The pieces were piled in the center of a ring of chattering aliens who then passed various pieces around the circle. Takuda was sure that everything was lost. Certain that it would take days for the DEST members to reassemble the parts, he took Takuda aside and commented on the problem. The little Tatate was surprised at the DEST commander's concern, and he assured Takuda that all would be well. He gave a short command, and as if by miracle, the Tatate put it all back together. By the fourth day of the trek, it became obvious that the enclaves were near. Areas that had obviously been cleared with a purpose rather than naturally began to fall across the line of march. At first, Takuda chose to bypass them, but by the middle of the day they were too numerous to avoid. In any case, they were deserted or abandoned. Some had once had structures on their perimeter, but an examination showed that these had been unoccupied for some time. In some instances, there were signs of violence. The DEST group proceeded with caution. As the last rays of the sun sliced across the sky, turning the undersides of the clouds into puffy peach confections, the open, sweeping savanna appeared at the edge of the forest. The DEST members strung out along the verge and settled into hide positions. They all knew that this would be a cold camp. The enemy, or the possible enemy, was in sight. The mechs remained 2 kilometers behind in hide locations of their own. The DEST members lifted their range-finding binoculars and swept the ground. A quick look and then a detailed search from near to far, left to right to left. To their wonderment, they discovered that a battle had been in progress here, though it appeared that the battle was over, at least for today. To the right, a force was withdrawing to the north, dragging what equipment it could. The southern force showed no intention to pursue. The fight must have been a draw. Takuda tried to identify the equipment he saw, but it was impossible. It was not that the gear was too far away to see, for his binoculars were capable of 400 times magnification, with white light, IR, and ultraviolet receptors. It was that he didn't understand what he saw. That the forces were not using modern power sources was immediately obvious. In almost all cases, huge stacks pouring smoke rose from the centers of the vehicles. The nearest one, its stack thrusting out from the right side and belching fire, had a great box-shaped housing on its back. As Takuda watched, the housing rotated slowly until a great gun with the diameter of a trash can pointed southward. The vehicle shuddered to a halt, and a moment later a great gush of flame roared from the muzzle of the gun. Takuda saw a huge black projectile arc across the intervening space between the two forces to smash into the ground and then bounce along toward the enemy. He could see figures scampering away from its path, until the ball vanished into a clump of trees. Then the firing vehicle belched fire from its horizontal stack and began to waddle its way north. The battle mechs were nowhere to be seen, nor was there any evidence that they had ever been there. PPCs, lasers, and even short-range missiles would have made short work of anything Takuda could see. He was amazed. With all the technology these people must have brought with them, what he saw was now a throwback to earlier times. Davood flopped down next to his position and also scanned the field with his glasses. "I don't see much iron," he said. Takuda blinked. Davood was right. He scanned the retreating vehicles again, paying particular attention to the tank-like engine that had fired the projectile. The cannon itself had the dark look of iron, but there was no other evidence of the material. Most of the external fixtures had the look of bronze and copper. That was impossible, of course. But then he remembered the enthusiasm of Seagroves and the rumors of what he had seen in Usagumo. Other metal on the wheels showed of brass and copper, but almost no iron. This was a strange society. Darkness fell over the field. The soft glow of lights from the enclaves north and south reflected against the gathering banks of clouds. The field of battle lay dark and abandoned. Even the IR sensors of the rangefinders could find no sign of life except for the soft glow cast by the debris of wrecked and burning vehicles. The combatants had all gone home for the evening. It was a strange war at best. "I guess I don't understand these people," said Davood.
"Neither do I, but I think we'll have to make contact. It seems that our mercenary friends haven't made a deal yet. I didn't see the mechs or any evidence of them. Maybe we still have time to make our case."
"Those mercs are going to be a tough group. They have the power and a head start on us." Davood crawled back into the deeper woods. "I'll get the group together. Do you want to talk to the pilots at the same time?"
"No," said Takuda. "We'll send out patrols first. I'll go back later and brief the pilots and the techs. We might want them for support later on."
End chapter 25. Complete. Time for chapter 26. Make sure everything is working right. Okay, it is. Some of my stuff was having issues a little bit ago, so I want to make sure that it is actually coming through the way that it's supposed to be. It's just the way it's supposed to be. Well, I wander around this wreck of a town. Okay, that's enough singing. Here we go. "26. Sine and Miranda slipped silently through the tall grass they had earlier been the field of battle. The two Tatate guides, one ahead, one behind, moved more boldly. They were, after all, indigenous to the area, and their presence would excite little notice. The two DEST members were a different matter. Even though they were not in uniform, their equipment would attract immediate comment. They could have worn electronic suppression suits, but that would have been too obvious to any observer. Takuda had made the decision, based on the desires of the three patrols themselves, that they should not wear the suits. The infrared suppression suits were also abandoned for this mission. Each of the patrols was to enter one of the three enclaves, make contact with the indigenous population, and determine the possible status of the mercenaries. To do that, they would have to be as inconspicuous as possible. The Tatate had helped describe what the Enclave humans wore, and the patrols had agreed to go unarmored and virtually unarmed. There was no use carrying heavy weapons. If they were discovered, they wouldn't have enough firepower to fight their way out. Stealth and blending were their only chances of survival. Far to the north, Arsenault and Busteau were making their way toward Osio. In the center, Knight and Holland would attempt to penetrate the religious enclave of the Amatukaze. Ariake Sene and Johann Miranda had been assigned the southern enclave, the merchant society of the Usagumo. In full darkness, they had slipped away from the base camp to begin their penetration. The patrols would take 3 nights and 2 days to accomplish their missions. That was why the Tatate had been assigned as guides. Not only would they be able to aid the patrols on the routes to and from the enclaves, but they would also be able to contact their brethren who lived in the cities. Deka and Topi had volunteered to accompany Sene and Miranda. They had previously acted as bearers for the heavy weapons section, and the 4 had developed an interesting rapport. The 2 Tatate looked on their human counterparts with deep respect and almost love. The 2 humans reciprocated with affection for their almost pets. Most communications consisted of hand signals accompanied by chirps on the part of the Tatate and single-syllable words by the humans. The walls of Usagumo loomed above them in the darkness. They had covered slightly more than 6 kilometers in the trip from the camp to the enclaves, and the patrol had encountered no signs of activity. Even the walls revealed few signs of life. Darkness while Topi scouted ahead. Presently she returned, and with chirps and hand signals gave Sene the information that this section of the wall had but a single guard, and he was asleep. The outer glacis and covered way were unguarded and showed few signs of recent occupation. The counterscarp and escarp of the dry moat were equally unattended. It was an easy climb up the crumbling slope to the rampart and the wall walk below. The 4 members dropped silently down inside the rampart and made their way to the access ramp. In a few moments, they had the defenses and the sleeping guard behind, and had entered the twisting byways of the enclave. The first part of the mission was complete. The streets were unlike anything Sene or Miranda had ever seen. Even in the poor sections of the city of the Draconis Combine, a sense of order prevailed. This was different. The avenues were narrow and twisting, blind alleys leading nowhere, and dirty. Piles of refuse were everywhere, many of them housing life of their own. Most of it was the rodent or lower animal type, but occasionally there was a clan of Tatate. There were even humans sleeping, or perhaps dead, lying beside the darkened buildings. The patrol and its Tatate guides moved through the area as quickly as possible. Ahead, the glare of lights drew them onward. Deka led the procession, for he knew where he was going in the labyrinthine maze. He had been in the city once before, but, like all Tatate, one time in an area was enough. In addition, he knew someone in the city and was sure they could use that individual's home as a safe house. Deka held up an arm to stop the patrol. Ahead was a brilliant glare of light and the rumbling clamor of activity. Sene crept forward to see the street ablaze with light and packed with humans busily going to and fro. The fact that it was well after midnight did not seem to matter at all. Sene scrutinized the people she saw, prosperous business types at play. They wore rich furs and spectacular colors, but there was something strange about their clothing. Sene studied them, comparing them mentally with others she had seen in the cities of the Combine. They were different, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She drifted back into the shadows and to the rest of the patrol. An hour later, the patrol was safe in the home of Piquete. The Tatate was aged, so obviously old that even Sine and Miranda could see it. He hobbled around his little domicile with the strained pain of those for whom life had not been easy. Paquette had been a house servant to the humans for more than 100 years, a valued retainer who had filled the position of part pet, part confidant, part servant. He was accepted among the Usagumo as a kind of fixture, seen when he was wanted, and unseen at other times. Paquette knew the Usagumo enclaves as well as Deka and Topi knew their forest. His knowledge came from more than just having been there before, and it was of more than the physical structure. He understood the dynamics of the city, its personalities, its hurts, and its dreams. There were people within the enclave who were willing followers, and there were those who felt a deep unease of how life treated them. It wasn't only those who lacked the wealth, so openly displayed, who were ready for change. They certainly were, but some of those at or near the top of the food chain also believed there should be a better way. It was to those people that Paquette would introduce the patrol. Ariake Sine was worried at first. The plan was for the patrols to stay one night at the residence of a Tatate and then move on. Dressed in appropriate clothing to some public hostelry. They were to watch and listen. Direct contact was not part of the plan, had not even been contemplated as part of the plan. But Paquette was enthusiastic. He and the two guides had talked through the entire night, their conversation becoming excited at times and at times conspiratorial. When Paquette woke Sine and Miranda the next morning, he had everything worked out. The patrol would move to the Polygon Falcon, a small but well-respected ryokan adjoining the main market area that Sine had seen the night before. Once ensconced in the area, Paquette would bring members of the Usagumo to meet the two humans. He had made a list of possible contacts, dividing them into a must list, a should list, and a could list. At the top of the must list was the name of Hama Shirayuki, the chief administrator of Usagumo. The name meant nothing to Sine, but the position made her heart beat slightly faster. Here was a prize for which she would risk everything. If she could bring his support back to Takuda, then the Usagumo might be willing to follow the dream of a better world. The fact that it was even on the list made the Usagumo a best bet. She and Miranda discussed the possibilities later that day as they settled into their room. The process of checking in had gone much better than Sine could have hoped. Paquette knew the Tatate at the desk, and so they'd encountered little difficulty obtaining a room. The only other person about was a single human sitting in the corner of the front parlor, reading a well-worn broadside. The man was surrounded by the scattered crumbs of tea cakes. The paper had rattled slightly and then resumed its crumpled shape. Except for that, they had encountered no one who might take notice of their presence. Late that night, there came a soft knock on the door. Sine and Miranda swept the remains of their meal into the armoire and prepared to meet their seventh guest of the day. The residents of the Usagumo had come calling, one at a time, throughout the hours of the early afternoon and into the evening. The two desk members had no idea how many more they would have to meet, but to have one appear this late meant he must be important. The room cleaned for their guest, Miranda opened the door to a tall, distinguished, well-dressed elderly man. They exchanged bows, and Hama Shirayuki stepped into the small room with the air of a man accustomed to being honored. He turned to Miranda.
"I am Hitman Shirayuki," he said with another bow. "You are the emissary of the other force."
Miranda closed the door and indicated Ariake Sine, who was seated at the small desk against the opposite wall.
"I am one of them, but the person in charge here is my Gunso, Ariake Sine." "In my world,"
said Tsurayuki with a slight raising of the lip.
We do not often find men who are willing to follow the command of a female.
Miranda saw Sine stiffen slightly. She made as if to speak, but Miranda gestured with his hand, holding her in place. In my world, he said with a deep bow, we have managed to overcome that archaic prejudice. The words came out with such smoothness that their thrust was almost unnoticed. The Johto Hai indicated a chair near Sine. Therefore, she will do all the speaking for us. Other interviews had been shared between the two soldiers, but Miranda wanted to make sure that Tsurayuki would feel as nervous as possible. One of the keys to a successful interview was to make the interviewee uncomfortable. Miranda felt he had succeeded. Tsurayuki settled himself into the indicated chair, straightened the skirts of his flowing gown, and smiled unctuously at Sine.
I have come to hear what you have to offer. I have already spoken with the other partnership, and we know what they can deliver. We were treated to a short demonstration yesterday, and another one today. They have been unwilling to commit their entire force, and that is understandable. But you will have to offer a great deal more in order to be within the bidding.
Tsurayuki had been in negotiations before and knew all the tricks. When uncomfortable, attack. Direct negotiations were not within the parameters established for Sine. She and Miranda were to observe and be prepared to make recommendations. She began to feel the danger of the situation. There are many things my Lord Takuda can offer you and the Usugumo, she said smoothly. Elevating Takuda from a mere shosa to that of nobility had been easy. It just seemed to flow. But Lord Takuda is not used to dealing with mere shonin. He would prefer to deal with a true samurai. When in doubt, attack. The comment made Tsurayuki flinch. Sine saw it, and knew. The hetman seemed to shrink perceptibly. He rubbed his hands to erase the film of perspiration that appeared unbidden. That was a weird end to a chapter. But hey, I didn't write it. I'm just here to read it to you. Hope you guys are enjoying. If you're out there, use chat. Say hello. Say hello, everyone. I like to know who's here, just because.
Because Usogumo.
All right. On to the next one. 27. Takuda spent the 2 days preparing for the confrontation he knew would come. He wasn't quite sure what to expect from the patrols he'd sent out, but he didn't have enough information about the enclaves to make even a tentative decision about the future. He felt a nagging doubt, one that grew every day, that there was more separation between the enclaves than he had first imagined. Dealing with 3 disparate societies was not what he had planned. Surely, he had thought, there must be some connection, however tenuous, with the heritage that he knew and understood. Now, he feared that he'd been wrong. With his skeleton force, Takuda made the best defensive preparations he could. The battle mechs were kept well to the rear. Their long-range laser weapons were better in support than their twin machine gun armament could ever be close in. If it came to the point where the machine guns were important, the situation would be beyond salvation. The Locusts, their pilots and technicians, and the Tatate who they'd adopted as extra help, were bedded down in a ravine 3 kilometers behind the edge of the woods. If needed, they could be on the front lines in something less than 10 minutes. The infantry were spread out across the edge of the woods with the 2 light teams on the flanks, the headquarters and heavy weapons in the center. Horg and Lost were alone on the flanks, Takuda and Parker DeVoot in the center. A team deploying seismic sensors were in the grasslands beyond the wood edge. With 3 members of the unit on patrol, the others did all the digging. Here again, the Tatate proved invaluable. All the humans needed to do was give some indication of what they wanted, and the Tatate set happily to work digging holes in the ground. In less time than it would have taken a combined engineering unit to accomplish the task, the Tatate had created complex underground tunnel systems. Indeed, it took some effort on Dakoto's part to get them to stop their burrowing. The savanna that fell away from the forest toward the broad river beyond was filled both days with the activity of combat. Takuta watched the intricate ballet through his binoculars, intrigued by the equipment and weapons he saw. The combatants were from Usagumo, moving from the south, and Amatokaze, approaching from the north. The forces deployed a kilometer apart without interference from the opposition. Then, as if by some unseen signal, they would come at each other. Takuta was able to identify simple missile and melee weapons on both sides of the lines. The long firearms, bulky and cumbersome, carried by blocks of men many ranks deep, were used to cover the deployment and movements of small groups of individuals with better-looking, belt-fed devices. These infantry groups would feint and dodge at each other with little contact. The main battle was carried on by mechanized forces that acted like champions, moving forward as individuals to engage in single combat with the champions from the other side. The champions were similar to the vehicles Takuta had seen on the first evening. Great steam-driven or internal combustion machines with slug-throwing weapons of various sizes and numbers. The Usagumo had a great boxy vehicle mounted on 6 wheels with a huge trash can protruding from its sloping snout. It would rumble slowly across the terrain until it reached a comfortable range. Then it would stop, the cannon rising and falling as though sniffing the air for the enemy. It would freeze, and a moment later would come a cloud of smoke and a great cylinder of stone arcing from the gun toward the target. It wasn't very accurate, and a nimble opponent could easily dodge. But most of the targets were not nimble. When the stone came down on an unfortunate opponent, the results were spectacular. Takuta saw one vehicle, struck on the roof, break in half under the impact. An instant later, there was a catastrophic explosion, probably caused by the rupture of the fuel cell. A huge cloud of flame and white smoke rose from the victim. No one emerged. On the first full day, the mechs appeared off to the south. Takuta held his breath as he waited for them to discover his group, but they paid no attention to his presence. The panther had stalked through the trees and paused. Then, with almost casual indifference, it had raised its right arm and fired the PPC at a champion from the north. The vehicle disintegrated under the blast. As if to even up the fight, it then fired the weapon at the Usagumo vehicle that had been engaged with it in combat. The demonstration over, and the sides returned to equality. The panther had departed. After the end of battle each day, the combatants would retreat from the field, dragging what vehicles they could. The only time Takuta saw actual blows exchanged between the infantry forces was when the Amatokaze tried to capture one of the Usagumo vehicles damaged close to their lines. The Usagumo rushed the robbers, deploying a block of infantry into a long line. There had been a roar of gunfire from the advancing force, returned by a ragged patter from the Amatokaze. Then the Amatokaze had retreated quickly like small children discovered in some prank. A cloud of sulphurous smoke drifted over the deserted field. Late in the evening on the second day, Horg reported IR blips coming from the north. An hour later, he reported a second target. There were the patrols returning from Osio and Amatokaze. Takuta passed the word of their approach and notified Los to be alert for the patrols. Arsenault was the first into the headquarters burrow. After glancing around at the complex of tunnels and shafts, he lifted his eyes in amazement. Takuda had indicated the Tatate as the architects, but did not wait for the second patrol to arrive before taking the Gunso's report. Arsenault told him they had taken rooms in a small traveler's ryokan near one of the gates. The people they met had described life in Osio as a feudal system gone crazy. The samurai lords dominated everything, freely using their katana to enforce their control. Arsenault had seen at least 2 beheadings in the street when a lower member of the society had not been acceptably subservient to a lord. No one had said a word or even touched the body until well after the samurai had departed. Some of the Osio they had met would be willing to throw off their shackles, but there are not many of these. The enclave was seething with unfocused unrest, but most of it was so sublimated that the immediate chances of a coup were scant. Takuda considered the report. Working in Osio would take time, but seemed to hold out hope, given that time. Its people were nominally loyal, but that loyalty might be quite brittle. There had been no mention of the presence of the mercenaries. That in itself was on the positive side of the equation. Knight and Holland appeared at the headquarters shortly after Arsenault had finished his report. After 2 days among the Amatokaze, they had nothing good to say about them. They were, said Holland, religious fanatics who hated the other enclaves as heretics. The whole concept of religion gone wild made Holland shudder. The Amatokaze dealt with the others because it was necessary for their survival, but they were engaged in a continuing war with the Usugumo over some liturgical slight the merchants had committed. The possibility of the Dest group turning anyone they met was reported as being low to non-existent. The populace was so indoctrinated by religious fervor that they would be probably totally unresponsive. Some of the younger people might be receptive, but even those should not be considered reliable. Again, Takuda had to consider the implications that no one had even mentioned the mercenaries. This time, it did not seem positive, the implication being that the mercs had made their decision to go with the Usugumo. Seagroves must have had more impact on Vost than anyone imagined. Now he had only to await the report of Sine and Miranda. Johann Miranda returned just before dawn, alone except for Topi. He was still in mundane dress, having left the Usugumo enclave so quickly that he hadn't bothered to change back into his uniform. His report came in a flood of unconnected sentences. Sine had been captured by the Usugumo and presumably turned over to Vost and his crew. There was no way of knowing what would happen to her, but Miranda was sure that the presence, if not the location, of the Dest group was known. Sine had gone with Homa Shirayuki for a meeting with some of the important members of the enclave, but according to Deika, it had been a trap. She had left instructions for Miranda to flee the city in such an event. He had disobeyed and spent time searching for her, but without success. Deika and Pikete had finally convinced him to return to Takuda for help. The people in Usugumo had made contact with the mercenaries, reported Miranda, and evidently they were about to strike a deal. The mechs would make their appearance on the battlefield under the control of the Usugumo very soon. Money was the driving force behind the Usugumo. There were those at the top of the pile, and there were those at the bottom. But either way, it was wealth everyone wanted. There would be plenty of ways to overthrow those at the top, but it would be difficult to convince them that a better society existed. Takuda was faced with 2 problems, both of them immediate and imperative. By first light, he could expect the mercs to attack from the Usugumo enclave. Even if they didn't know his exact location, they could make some assumptions. They would come looking for them, and they would probably have the support of the Usagumo ground troops. The infantry and vehicles would not be a problem, but he couldn't afford more casualties to his already weakened force. The second problem was the capture of Sanae. It was a tradition among Dest not to leave people behind, not even the dead. Now one of his team had been captured. She would have to be rescued, or at least returned as soon as possible. He turned to Emerdine Knight, who had reappeared in the headquarters unbidden, almost as though he knew his presence would be requested.
"Knight," ordered Takuda, "take your section with Miranda and Topi. Get Sanae."
Knight nodded and left. That took care of the second problem. Now he must deal with the first, an imminent attack by the mercenaries. As far as Takuda could tell, he had two choices: fight the mercs where they were, or run for the cover of the woods and ravines. If he chose the former, then Knight and his section would not know where to return. But there might not be anything left for them to come home to. If he ran, there was no assurance that the team would survive. He explained the problem to Parker Davoud, hoping the former dropship pilot might have some other ideas. He didn't. But Dakota, listening to the discussion, did. He had seen the locusts stumbling around under the trees at the first camp. He had seen Mark Jacobs falling down repeatedly during the march to the enclaves. Now he asked questions about what the mechs could really see. Why not, he proposed, build a fake position and let the enemy mechs literally stumble into it? Not only would it give Takuda the chance to do some damage, but it might also reduce the perceived value of the mechs to their prospective employers. Takuda considered the possibilities. He had seen the Tatate in their digging frenzy, and they certainly were capable of excavating traps. It just might work, he thought, and it certainly was worth a try. He turned to Dakota and gave his consent. They would fall back slightly into the woods, leaving IR emitters behind. That would draw the mercenaries onto the position. The Tatate would handle the construction of the traps.
Next chapter done. Now we will move on to another one, yes, very momentarily.
Lemon tea. Lemon tea like the corners of my mind. Scattered pictures of the way we were. All right, here we go. Let's get to our next chapter, shall we? "28. Kill her now and get it over with," said Elizabeth Hund, her voice flat and strained. "We've got all the information out of her that we can."
"What information?" replied Post. "We don't know anything except that Takuda is close by, and we knew that just from catching her. There's a lot more to get."
Hund kicked viciously at the wooden table that held the pinioned body of Ariaki Sanae. The desk sergeant didn't respond. She was so deeply drugged that the pain from the wrist and ankle restraints didn't even penetrate. Hund kicked again. "Look, she's so doped up now that we'll never get anything out of her. You didn't have to give her 4 shots, it just blacked her out."
"We weren't getting anything out of her before the shots either. Those desk types can stand a lot of pain. The drugs at least got her to babble about some combat she'd seen, something about wrecked vehicles."
"You just didn't like the screams." Hund walked around the other side of the table so she could see Vost directly. I thought you liked a little pain with your women. Or is it you just like women?
You knew the deal when you came with us. You have no rank better than either Fiona or Michelle, and if Tammy Wilson wants some of the action, she's welcome to it as well. You knew that coming in.
Juggling 3 women, and perhaps a 4th, was harder than he'd thought it would be. The 2 techs had been docile about the situation, but Hund, the navigator of the ill-fated Teledyne, was a different matter. Perhaps it was because she was odd man out in the organization, with nothing really to do, that made her such a witch. Vost was sorry he'd decided to add her to his list.
In any case, we've got enough.
He stepped away from the table to gaze out the window that looked out over the early sun and the broad expanse of grasslands that stretched toward the distant forest.
You're the one with the navigation skills, he continued. Use some of that to find out where Takuda and his people are. I'll deal with the rest of it.
Hund left the unconscious sergeant to come alongside Vost. She took his hand in hers. I'm sorry I snapped at you, she said, resting her head on his shoulder. He didn't draw away, and she held him tighter. I think she's dangerous. We know she's talked to Tsurayuki. After all, he's the one who gave her to us. I think he'll use that to cut a better deal. But aside from that, she may have talked with others. It's like a virus in the body. She and it needs to be destroyed. Kill her now.
Vost turned to face her. She's a danger only if we don't act. Find me Takuda, and we'll go stomp him. That's what will convince these people that we're the future. And an expensive future.
Hund rested her head on his chest. All right, Garber, she purred. I'll find them. You stomp them, but then this one is mine.
Done. Find them, and she's yours.
It didn't take Elizabeth Hund long to get a reasonable fix on Takuda and his group. She knew from the information Sine had given to Tsurayuki that they were between 5 to 8 hours away by foot. The patrol had made it to the city in one night. She also knew that other contact patrols had been sent to the other enclaves. That put the Dest group somewhere north of the city and probably at the edge of the woods. The drugged reference to a battle gave her an even better fix. The forces of the Usagumo had been in contact with those of the Amatukaze. A few questions to the leaders of the Usagumo gave her the battle location. She had the Takuda force well located. The sun was directly overhead when the battle mechs fired up. They had made their headquarters in one of the deserted bastions of the outer wall, well separated from the rest of the defenses and outside the city proper. Seagroves and Pesht had wanted to be inside the enclave, but Vost had vetoed that idea at once. He was more interested in keeping the mercenaries separated from their possible employers until the deal was done. In any case, the bastion provided security. The bastion, with its towering scarp and counterscarp, would keep all but the most insistent away from the mechs. The walls were no problem for the two land mechs, and Seagrove's Lamb could also traverse them with ease. Being isolated had the advantage of adding mystery to their presence. The operation against Takuda was to be a straight brute force and ignorance operation. 3 mechs against less than a dozen infantry would be a cakewalk. Even a lance as weak as Vost's should be able to deal with them. Granted, Takuda's group had a short-range missile launcher, but how much did that count against the smothering fire that the Javelin could deliver at the same range? If Takuda's people had the temerity to open fire with their SRM, the Javelin would deluge their location with its own missiles. The counterfire radar on the right side of the Javelin's head could plot the location of the launcher to within 25 meters, And even if its missiles didn't make a direct hit against the system, the dozen explosions in the area would probably make the enemy gunner very respectful. There would be no second shot. It was BF and I all the way. Vost and Pesht blasted out of the bastion in boiling clouds of incandescent gas. They hunched down just outside the walls and began to make their way through the waist-high grass toward the scene of the previous day's combat. Seagroves would fly out later. Fuel for the air portion of the LAM was critical. He still had hours of flight remaining, but the fuel he had scrounged at the dropship would have to last until he could find a suitable local substitute. And that would have to wait until after they'd finalized the deal. Pesht trotted out ahead of the medium Panther, and Vost had to call him back. He wanted to hold back the Javelin's SRM armament until they'd located the targets. Vost was in the interesting position of having to lead with the medium and follow with the light mech. In normal conditions, the light Javelin would have been deployed in support of the two Locusts, with the Panther and the LAM as reserve. But Vost didn't have the two Locusts. No one did. Seagroves had reported a definite kill on one of them, and the other was damaged at best. The finest technicians in the galaxy couldn't have jury-rigged the parts to build a functioning mech, and Dakuda did not have the finest techs available. Nor did he have the depot workshop such repair activity would require. The mercenary settled comfortably into the Panther's command seat and let its easy gait across the savannah lull him into a feeling of euphoria. The scattered trash of the battlefield littered the grasslands. Patches of burned, brittle stalks marked the death throes of some giant metallic beast. This was the site of the recent and continuing combats. He knew there would be no fighting here today, however. The Yamatokaze and the Usaguma were observing a one-day truce. It had all been arranged. There were, however, observers from both enclaves somewhere among the patches of trees. This would be a good sales promotion. Vost turned the pair of mechs toward the forest. The Javelin moved up to the left of the Panther, 200 meters away and slightly behind. Vost noted that the other mechs positioned on the secondary screen as well as that on the heads-up display. He wiped the information from the HUD, leaving nothing but targeting symbols. There was no use having it cluttered with extraneous data. With no other mechs in the battle, the location and activity of the Allied mechs would just get in the way. Vost pressed forward on the throttle and felt the pressure against his back as the Panther began to gain speed. The Cat's Eye 5 targeting system swept the approaching woodline. No targets. Vost adjusted the sensor array to IR maximum. Under normal conditions, the infrared sensors were adjusted to react to the heat of a mech rather than a human. It was only in city fighting that the presence of humans became a survival imperative. In restricted terrain, where the PNT-9R was even more dangerous than in the open, the shadowy presence of an infantryman could spell the difference between a mech's survival and becoming a heap of glowing metal. The secondary screen showed the Javelin to the right rear as a bright green, its IFF identification number across the top of the image. Vost disregarded it. Then, emerging from the background clutter of the forest to the front, Vost saw the soft glow of an IR signature. A human. A human lurking in a hidden bunker right on the edge of the woods. He let the crosshairs of the PPC steady on the image. At this range, he could blast both bunker and the human to smithereens. His finger tightened on the trigger. No, he thought. That would be too easy. He lowered the mech's right arm and accelerated. Stomp the little bugger flat, he thought. That'll show him who's boss. The panther sprang into the air and came down on the unmoving IR image, its right leg extended stiff and straight for the crushing blow. Just as the foot crashed through the top of the surprisingly soft bunker roof, Vost had a fleeting thought. The poor, stupid grunt had not moved. The mech's foot, a 3 by 6 meter slab of articulated Maximilian armor, sank through the overhead cover and kept on going down. And going. And going. And then stopped dead. The shock threw Vost against the restraining harness. The panther's right foot was caught in an 8-meter deep pit, off balance. The mech's impetus had carried it forward. Vost brought the left leg under the toppling mech, but it stubbed its toe against the ground. He fought to get it free. The mech continued forward, falling. Vost swung the left arm back, trying to twist the mech free, trying to throw some weight onto the immobile left leg. It was no use. With stately grandeur, the panther toppled forward into the scrub, the PPC driving itself into the soft earth. Then the cockpit struck, and Vost was thrown against his harness again. His feet came off the controls. His finger tightened on the firing buttons. The PPC roared to life. Great gouts of molten, incandescent, glowing dirt spewed out. The right shoulder of the thrashing mech lurched backwards, twisting the head face down against the ground. Vost hung suspended by the harness as he fought to regain control. By the time he got the panther upright and functioning, the Javelin was into the forest verge. Vost shouted a warning over the comm line, but it was too late. He had a momentary vision of the Javelin lurching forward, its legs enmeshed in a web of vines. A tree snapped upright, his secondary screen showing the legs of the mech sideways. The Javelin broke free and staggered on. "Where are they?" screamed Pesht into his communicator. "They're everywhere! I'm lost!" Vost swept the area. There were IR signatures scattered through the trees. More signatures than Takuda could possibly have men. It was a trap. The secondary screen glowed with the identification of the incoming lamb. A heavy laser strike vaporized the ground in front of the panther, leaving smoldering branches and glowing earth. Vost looked around for the antagonist, but it was just the lamb arcing away. "Seagroves, I'll get you for that!" "Sorry, boss. Thought it was one of them in front of you." There was a pause. Vost thought he heard a chuckle as the transmission ended. "I have no targets," came the next report from the lamb. Vost saw another IR blur. "This time I'll get you, you little crud," he thought. The signature blinked. It was retreating into the deeper forest. The panther sprang forward. There was a slight tug on the mech's legs as it passed between two trees. "Damn vines," thought Vost. "Gotta be careful." Then he saw the log swinging toward the panther's torso. He braced himself, felt the shock as the wood struck home. This was madness. There was nothing but shadows to fight. "Pull back," he ordered over the comm line. "We're out of here." Excuse me, guys. I don't know why my, coughing. Whew. All right, let me go look at something real quick. All right, we got those. Meld recording studio. Meld studio recording. Recording output 2025-0506 at 8:09:27 p.m. Cool. they're working. I guess let's see if I can get some more chapters in before I, have a conniption over here.
Conniption? You have a conniption.
All right, here we go. "29. Remaining hidden in the patches of scrub outside the main gate of the Usagumo Enclave, the 4 Dest members and the Tatate watched the mechs blast out of the bastion and stalk northward along the river. Knight, Holland, Horg, Miranda, and Topi huddled as low as they could. The plan was to enter the Enclave at dawn, if possible, and they had moved from the Dest position and across the open ground as fast as they dared. But they hadn't been quick enough. By the time they reached the outskirts of the Enclave, activity had begun at the gate and on the walls, forcing them to wait until traffic around the entrance became heavy enough for their entrance to pass unnoticed. They decided to make their move just before noon, but a flurry of activity in the bastion housing the mechs had driven them to cover again. Now, as the mechs leaped out of their fortification, the team had their chance. The sudden explosion of the Panther and Javelin's jump jets had scattered the stray pedestrians. In the confusion, Knight gave the word, and the 5 rose from their positions and joined the confused throng crowding toward the main gate. The guards, who usually checked the identification of all who passed through, were huddled in their gatehouse, peering through the vision slits at the settling dust. They waved the crowd of panicked people through the gate, the Dest group getting past them without earning so much as a glance. The guards would become officious later, making up in arrogance their lack of attention earlier, but not now. Toby got the 4 humans off the main street and into the back alleys as quickly as possible. Miranda was still in the mundane clothing he had worn during his sojourn in Usagumo, and Knight and his section were dressed in the clothes they'd worn among Amatukaze. Now, they realized, the dress of the 3 enclaves was so strikingly different that they were immediately recognizable as outsiders. They scurried into an alley and huddled behind some crates. They didn't have to wait long. A pair of civilian humans wearing the loose jackets and trousers favored by the lower class of Usagumo approached. As a pair passed the team's hiding place, Miranda stepped out in front of them and raised his hand. The 2 men stopped, beginning to utter protests at this unwarranted intrusion on their lives. What was this civilian doing trying to stop them? They never got a satisfactory answer. Their necks were broken before they hit the street, and their clothes were off a moment later. The job finished, Knight and Horg were already dressed in attire appropriate to the Enclave before they noticed the small group of Tatate children staring at them in open-eyed wonder. Then the little bird-like creatures fled before any explanation could be given. The team moved on, directed by Topi toward their goal. The little alien trotted ahead, chirping to any of his kind that she encountered along the way. She nodded and bobbed as she went, sometimes stopping for more lengthy conversations with the adults. But it was from the children that she seemed to get most of her information. The adults occasionally made scolding sounds as the humans approached, snapping their beaks in the direction of the team. The children crowded around at a respectful distance, their eyes bulging wider than usual. Topi directed the team through the streets, heading directly toward the highest point in the Enclave. She finally stopped where an alley so narrow that they had to squeeze through sideways debouched onto a broad square. She hunkered down and gestured to Knight, indicating a room on the second floor. She rattled off some words that the section leader didn't understand, but the little alien was quite insistent. Knight made walking signs with his fingers, and she nodded. When he indicated that she should accompany the group, she shook her head violently. She would not enter the building. Topi stood to her full height and let the Dest members crawl between her legs until they were all in front of her. She spoke to Horg, the last in the line of 4, as he passed, and made some guttural sound. It sounded like a benison, and Horg took it as such. Knight indicated that Horg was to stay outside and guard their escape route. Then they were ready to move inside. Knight went first, stepping into the early afternoon sunlight that flooded the square. The building directly in front of them was an imposing structure of stone and gold. The edifice was apparently intended to dazzle and humble all who approached, but Knight was too interested in deciphering its internal structure to be impressed. The broad double doors probably gave access to a central staircase that led to the second floor, he thought. That floor probably had a central corridor that ran the length of the building, with doors leading off to rooms on either side. Up the stairs and then down the hall toward the windows Topi had indicated. He made a mental map of the building just by looking at the exterior. The others were doing the same, coming to the same conclusions. Training and experience made a difference. They plunged through the darkness of the entrance. The stairway was ahead in the light that poured through a broad window halfway up and above a landing. The stairs doubled back on themselves to reach the second floor. They started up, climbing slowly as though they belonged there. They made the turn, 2 going up each side. The transverse corridor was what they expected. They turned left, Miranda hanging back to cover the rear of the other 3. The right hall was empty, but the one they chose had a uniformed guard. He raised his hand to stop them, but before he could utter a word, Knight challenged him.
"We're here for the prisoner. And why are you not at the door to her cell? You should be there, and not wandering the hall. Go there at once, or I will report you to your superior."
The guard stood open-mouthed at the challenge. It took him a moment to recover, to remember that he was at his assigned post, to recognize that the language used by the stranger was just as strange as his garb. He opened his mouth to speak, but it was too late. The thrust took him square in the throat, crushing his larynx. He tried to speak, tried to gasp, but there was nothing. He reached for the pistol in the holster on his right side, but he felt a hand grasp his wrist. He struggled. Then a red mist covered his eyes. Knight lowered the guard to the floor and lifted the heavy pistol from its holster. He motioned Miranda to stand guard while the others went down the corridor in swift strides. They came to the door of the suspected room. Knight put his ear to the solid wooden door to listen, but he heard no clue as to who or what was beyond the portal. He motioned Holland to stand to one side of the door while he took the other. They brought their short-barreled laser rifles out from under their cloaks. He then nodded to Andy Holland. She crept forward to try the knob. The solid gold heavy and rich under her fingers. She twisted it gently until it came against the stops. The door was locked. She stepped back and leveled her rifle at the lock plate below the knob. Knight tapped her on the shoulder and bent to whisper.
"Not the laser. The gold will only absorb and dissipate the heat, fusing the lock. Use the slug pistol."
"But the noise," whispered Holland.
"Everyone will hear it." "Can't be helped. We'll have to move fast."
She nodded, shifted the rifle to her left hand, and took the heavy pistol from Knight. Poetic justice that she used the guard's pistol to smash the lock. The rapport of the weapon was loud in the confines of the corridor. The golden lock plate, knob, and innards of the mechanism exploded under the hammering impact. The door swung inward. Andy Holland was through the door before it reached its stops. She rolled to the right, ending her move in a crouch. Sunlight cascaded through the windows beyond, momentarily blinding her. Then she saw the table and the pinioned figure. She cleared the room with a quick glance. No use being surprised by someone else. Clear. She sprang to the table. The figure of Ariaki Sine lay motionless. Holland bent over the body, listening for the sound of breathing while she felt Sine's throat for a pulse. A yes to both. Sine was still alive. She slashed at the bonds with her vibro dagger, the straps giving almost no resistance. Behind her she heard the high-pitched whine of a laser rifle and Knight yelling,
"Faster, Andy! We've got company!"
There was motion beside her, and then Johann Miranda was there, sweeping the prostrate figure off the table and into his arms. He turned toward the door. Holland jumped in front of him and led the way into the corridor. Knight was waiting, a laser rifle in each hand. Holland saw the blast deflectors glow red as Knight fired both weapons from the hip. She had a momentary vision, probably from some old vidisplay she'd seen as a youth, of hatted gunfighters moving down a street, weapons in their hands, firing them from the hip. Then the vision was swept aside by reality. As he moved down the hall, Miranda fired into the darkened corridor, the laser hit splashing golden minnows of slag from the walls. His shots were unhurried, first at one side, then the other, a machine doing its job. She trotted after him. Behind her she could hear the heavy steps of Knight. Miranda stopped shooting and led the way down the stairs, 2 at a time. Then they cleared the landing, with the others pounding along behind. Somewhere in the building a klaxon sprang to life, its shrill blasts echoing through the halls. From somewhere above came the sound of doors slamming. They didn't stop, didn't look back. Knight fired up the stairs without taking aim. At the foot of the stairs, Holland saw silhouettes to the right. She sprayed laser shots at them and saw figures fall away from the mob. Then there was a flash of light and a roar. Something hummed past her head to rattle off the wall behind her. A cloud of acrid, pungent smoke that stank of decay swept over her. She kept going. The square was blindingly bright. Holland paused, letting her eyes adjust. The others crowded behind her. Civilians were scattering across the bright stonework. There were other, uniformed types who stood their ground. A sharp sound made Holland turn to her right. A lump of lead glanced off the stone pillar and howled away. Then a horrible, shattering, screeching roar drew the attention of the party to the broad central street that led from the square. Rattling into the plaza came a strange machine, all lumps and knobs and exhaust stacks. The copper-bound wheels screeched pathetically as it turned toward the building. Guards scattered from in front of it, others ran toward it cheering. Emblazoned on the front slope in green and gold was a symbol of Usagumo. The monstrosity shuddered to a halt in front of the group. Holland raised her laser rifle and let the crosshairs center on a vision slit. The top of the hatch popped open, and the head of Topi emerged. The little Tatate bobbed out, waving her arms toward them. From somewhere to the rear came another roar and the howl of a ricochet. Topi ducked and looked back. She waved her arms more enthusiastically.
"Let's go!"
shouted Knight as he vaulted into the vehicle.
"We can't run from this mob, but we can use this. Let's go!"
The team was no sooner on the vehicle, not yet within its protective confines, before it shuddered into reverse. Holland heard shouts of terror and disbelief as the guards scattered away from the flailing wheels. Then the vehicle was moving forward, rumbling toward the main street and the gate beyond. It picked up speed going downslope, roaring past the gate guards as they raised their hands in protest. Then they were out on the main road, still careening along, the vehicle lurching and banging as it went. Horg sat in the driver's seat, cursing at the unresponsive controls like one possessed. Inside the dark interior, the little team held on to whatever they could find that was not burning hot. Cradle among them was the unconscious form of Ariake Sane. Alright guys, it's a little bit shorter than normal, but I'm going to call it here. I'm fighting having to cough as I'm going through this, and rather than continuing to have to try to do that, I'm going to call it after 5 chapters. We'll try to pick up the additional chapters next week. But I will get these uploaded onto my YouTube as soon as I'm able to, so that way if you missed any of them, you'll be able to pick up what you have missed. Thank you all for being here with me tonight. I will not be back tomorrow. One of the members that I play with in my Pathfinder game once a month has asked that she not be on stream anymore. And I have always said that I will not stream if I have one of the members who does not want to be broadcast. So that particular Wednesday, we won't be streaming, but the other ones we still will. So I will be back Thursday for Stompy Mech Night. I hope you guys all have yourselves a wonderful evening, and I'll see you guys again soon. Good night, everyone.